The handcuffs clicked around my wrist before I could finish my sentence. Officer Derek Holloway smiled at me the way a man smiles when he's already won. Slow, lazy, and deeply satisfied with himself. He reached into the wheel well of my Nissan Altima and produced a Glock 19 that I had never seen before in my life. "Well, well," he said, holding it up to the streetlight with 2 fingers like a trophy. "What do we have here?" He didn't know my name. He didn't know my badge number, my security clearance, or the fact that 48 hours later he would be the one staring at the floor of an interrogation room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Marcus Webb, and for 11 years I had worked counterterrorism for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically targeting domestic extremist networks operating in the Mid-Atlantic region. I had sat across tables from men who built pipe bombs in their basements and smiled at their wives over Sunday dinner. I had worn wires in rooms where the wrong word could have ended my life. I had testified before closed Senate committees at 34 years old, and I was not, by any reasonable measure, a man who scared easily. But I was also a black man in a neighborhood where I grew up, and sometimes those 2 facts existed in completely separate universes that had nothing to say to each other. That fall I was running what the Bureau called a deep maintenance period, 3 weeks of desk work following a 9-month undercover embed with a white nationalist cell operating out of rural Pennsylvania. 9 months of letting men with swastika tattoos call me their brother, of nodding along to things that made bile rise in my throat, of being someone else so completely that some mornings I had to stand at the bathroom mirror for a full minute before Marcus Webb came back to himself. When the operation finally closed and we made 12 arrests, my supervisor, SSA Linda Ferris, had essentially ordered me home. "Sleep in your own bed," she said. "Eat food that doesn't come from a gas station. Remember what your actual face looks like." So that Thursday evening I drove to my mother's house in East Park, a neighborhood in East Baltimore where I'd grown up, where she still lived in the same brick row house with the green shutters and the ceramic cat she'd kept on the porch since 1994. I brought her a rotisserie chicken from the good grocery store, and we sat in her kitchen while she talked about her neighbor Doris and her church fundraiser and whether my cousin Terrell was ever going to straighten out his life. The kitchen smelled like cedar and old coffee, and the radiator knocked against the wall at irregular intervals, the same rhythm it had knocked my entire childhood. I ate 3 plates of her macaroni, and I felt genuinely like a human being for the first time in months. I left just before 9. My mother stood on the porch in her housecoat, arms crossed against the October cold, and watched me back out of the driveway. I saw her in the rearview mirror, small, still, one hand raised halfway, and I thought that I should visit more. I always thought that. 3 blocks from her house, I pulled into the parking lot of a corner store called King's to grab a bottle of water for the drive home. It was Thursday. Quiet. A few teenagers near the entrance not doing much of anything except existing. I was wearing jeans and a gray hoodie. My badge and my service weapon were locked in the center console of my car because I was not on duty, and because walking into my mother's neighborhood dressed like a federal agent felt like wearing a costume somewhere that still remembered me at 14, skinny and loud, chasing a basketball down this exact street. I was back at my car, bottle in hand, maybe 90 seconds after I'd gone in, when the cruiser pulled in. It came slow, angling across the lot in a way that wasn't casual, deliberate, designed to box me in against the driver's side. 2 officers inside. The one who stepped out first was Holloway, though I didn't know his name yet. He was tall, pale, with the build of someone who'd played high school football and had been coasting on it for the 20 years since. His hand rested on his belt before he'd even fully cleared the door. The second officer stayed in the car, which I noticed. Something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with October. "Hey," Holloway said, his voice carrying the thin costume of friendliness over something flatter underneath. "What are you doing out here tonight?" I looked at him steadily. I had spent 9 months in a room with actual terrorists. I had learned in that time to keep my face perfectly neutral, while every nerve in my body ran a threat assessment. I kept it neutral now. "Getting water," I said, holding up the bottle. He looked at it like it offended him. Then he looked at me, the slow once-over that was about establishing something rather than seeing anything. "You live around here." "My mother does." "But you don't." It wasn't a question. I told him I lived in Federal Hill, which was true. He asked for my ID. I gave it to him. My Maryland driver's license, nothing on it about what I actually did for a living. He held it for a long time, longer than it took to read, the way people hold things when they're deciding rather than looking. That was the moment. I knew it even then. That was the moment I should have said 2 words that would have ended everything in 30 seconds. But something made me wait. Call it professional instinct. Call it 11 years of learning that you gather more information by watching than by acting. I wanted to see how far he was willing to go. He handed the license back and told me to stay put, then walked to my car. I heard him try the passenger door. Locked. He came back and told me to open it. "What's the reason for the stop?" I asked. He didn't answer. His hand had moved from his belt to somewhere more definitive. "Step away from the vehicle," he said. I stepped away. What happened next took less than 90 seconds, but I have replayed it enough times that in memory it moves at the speed of something watched through deep water. Holloway swept his flashlight along the driver's side frame. He crouched near the rear wheel well. He stood, and then, with a motion so practiced it was almost elegant, he held up a Glock 19, dark against the orange glow of the parking lot lights. "Sir," he said, with theatrical gravity. "Is this your weapon?" The plastic bottle crinkled in my hand. The cold that passed through me then was different from anything the weather had to offer. Not fear. Something colder than fear. Recognition. Because I had seen this before. Not to me, but I had read enough case files, sat in enough debrief rooms to know exactly what I was watching. My first thought was completely clinical. I registered the absence of latex gloves on Holloway's hands. Either he was sloppy, or he had already wiped the weapon and wasn't worried. I noted that his partner had finally stepped out of the cruiser, positioning himself between me and the street. I noted that the teenagers near the entrance were gone, scattered the moment the cruiser had pulled in, because they had learned early what I had apparently needed 11 years and a federal career to almost forget. There are situations in which the most dangerous thing you can be is a witness. "That's not my weapon," I said. My voice was level. I was proud of my voice in that moment. "It was in your wheel well." "I know where you found it." Something flickered across his face. Not doubt, more like recalibration. He'd expected something else. Fear. Bargaining. The specific kind of collapse that I imagined had played out in this parking lot before, in other parking lots like it, on other Thursday nights. He glanced at his partner without turning his head. "Roberts, cuff him." Roberts was younger, with the uncomfortable bearing of a man who hadn't yet decided what kind of officer he was going to be. He came around with the restraints and I let him. The cuffs clicked against my wrists. I was already running a different calculation entirely. My badge and service weapon were in the center console, 3 feet away. I had said nothing about them because I was still watching, still gathering, because Derek Holloway had just planted a firearm in my wheel well, and I needed to know exactly how far he intended to take it before I showed him what he'd actually done. Holloway was already on his radio, narrating a story he had clearly written in advance. I caught the words, "felony stop," and "illegal firearm," and "subject uncooperative." And at those last 2 words, something shifted behind my ribs. Not pain, not fear. Something harder and quieter than either. I was put in the back of the cruiser. Through the window, I watched Holloway standing by my Altima, hands on his hips, looking satisfied. He pulled out his phone and took a photograph of the Glock sitting on the hood. Documentation, I thought. He was photographing his own evidence, his own crime, and he was doing it with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been told he was wrong. It was, I would later tell Linda Ferris in a conference room on the 4th floor of the Baltimore field office, the most expensive mistake Derek Holloway had ever made in his life. But that night, I sat in the back of his cruiser with my hands behind my back and the faint smell of someone else's fast food in the upholstery, and I said nothing, because I had learned in 9 months of living inside a lie that the most powerful thing a person can do is wait. They booked me at the East Park District Station, a building I had driven past my entire childhood without ever expecting to be inside in handcuffs. The desk sergeant, a broad woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, took my license and typed my name into the system with 2 fingers. I watched the screen from across the counter, and I knew, from the slight pause, the way her fingers slowed and then stopped, that something had come up. She glanced at me, glanced at Holloway, said nothing. "He's clean," she announced in the flat tone of someone who has given up being surprised by anything. "Clean doesn't mean legal," Holloway said, with the satisfied authority of a man who believed his own story. "They put me in a holding room, not a cell, which I noted as a small concession, with a bolted table and a plastic chair and a smell of disinfectant that had never fully overpowered something older and worse underneath it. I sat there for 40 minutes. I thought about the Glock. I thought about the wheel, well. I thought about the photograph Holloway had taken on his personal cell phone, and about how that photograph was about to become the most important piece of evidence in a federal misconduct investigation. I thought about Roberts, the younger officer, and the look on his face when the cuffs had clicked. Not satisfaction, like Holloway, but a tightness around the eyes that might have been discomfort. Possibly a conscience, possibly just nerves. Either way, a loose thread. At the 41-minute mark, I asked the officer at the door if I could make a phone call. He said yes, and I dialed Linda Ferris. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been asleep. Linda never fully slept when an agent was in the field, and in some part of her mind I suspected I was still in the field. "Webb," she said. Just my name, the way she always said it, flat, alert, like a hand pressing a button. "I need you to do something for me," I said, keeping my voice low and completely level. "I'm in custody at East Park District. A patrol officer named Holloway planted a 9mm in my wheel well about 90 minutes ago. I'm being charged with illegal firearm possession." There was a pause, not a long one. "Did you identify yourself?" "Not yet." Another pause, shorter. "Good," she said, and I could hear the specific quality of her silence, the sound of Linda Ferris shifting into a different gear. "Don't. Not until I get someone there. Give me 20 minutes. She hung up. I set the phone down on the table and folded my hands in front of me, and I waited with the particular stillness of a person who has stopped being afraid and started being patient. It took 17 minutes. The door opened, and a man I didn't recognize, mid-50s, navy suit, the kind of careful unremarkableness that screams federal government, came in and sat across from me without introducing himself. He set a manila folder on the table. Then he looked at me for a long moment. "Special Agent Webb," he said. "I'm Assistant Special Agent in Charge David Pruitt, Baltimore Field Office. I apologize for the delay." "No delay," I said. I was gathering information. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite admiration, more like recognition. He slid the folder across to me. Inside were printed stills from the parking lot security camera at King's Corner store, a camera that Holloway had either not noticed or not bothered to check, because it had a clear, well-lit, unobstructed view of the exact section of the parking lot where my Nissan had been parked. Frame by frame, Holloway crouching by the rear wheel well, his right hand going in empty, his right hand coming out with the Glock. The timestamps were precise to the second. The cold that moved through me then was different from the first cold. This one felt like the door of something very large swinging open. "He photographed it himself," I said. "On his personal phone. We've already requested a warrant for it." "And Roberts?" Pruitt's expression did something careful. "Officer Roberts has asked to speak with an attorney, which suggests he has something to say." I set the folder down and looked at the ceiling. There was a water stain up there shaped, loosely, like the state of Florida. I had stared at it for the past 40 minutes without registering it, and now it was the most specific, vivid thing in the room. "How long has Holloway been doing this?" I asked. Pruitt was quiet for one beat too long. "That's what we're about to find out," he said. They released me at 11:42 p.m. Holloway was somewhere in the building. I knew it, could feel it, but I didn't see him. I walked out into the October cold and stood on the front steps of the station for a moment, breathing. The air tasted like car exhaust and something faintly sweet from a bakery somewhere nearby. My wrists were sore where the cuffs had been. I looked down at them and then I looked up at the sky, which was clear and very black and full of stars that the city lights couldn't quite kill. My mother called when I was halfway to my car. "Marcus, baby." Doris called me. She saw a police car. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mom. I'm out." "Out?" Her voice went quiet in the way that meant she was deciding how scared to be. "Out of what?" "It's handled," I said. "I'll call you in the morning. I promise." A pause. Then softly, "You sound like your father when you say it like that." My father had been a homicide detective for 23 years. I took that as the specific kind of compliment she meant it to be. The next 72 hours moved the way federal investigations move when someone has been very, very foolish. Fast, quiet, and with the finality of a door closing on a room that will not be reopened. The security footage from King's went to the FBI's evidence response team, who confirmed it was unedited and continuous. Roberts retained his attorney, and then, from what Pruitt told me later, spent approximately 4 hours in a conference room deciding what kind of man he was going to be before choosing to tell the truth. He confirmed that Holloway had done this before. He could name 2 other occasions he had personally witnessed. He could name a third that he had heard about from a colleague who had since transferred to a different district. The Glock itself came back clean of my fingerprints. Entirely clean, in fact, which told a story of its own, because a gun that had spent any time in a wheel well collects oil and grit, and this one had neither. On Saturday morning, 2 days after the parking lot, Derek Holloway was arrested at his home in Parkville. His wife answered the door in a bathrobe, and I was told she looked more resigned than surprised. The expression of a woman who had been waiting for a specific knock, and had simply not known which morning it would come. Holloway was charged with evidence tampering, civil rights violations under federal statute, and 3 additional counts related to the prior incidents Roberts had described. His partner on 2 of those prior occasions, a sergeant named Curtis Beale, who had transferred to the Western District the previous spring, was charged the same afternoon. The press picked up the story on Sunday. By Monday, it was national. I watched some of it on my laptop at my kitchen table in Federal Hill, drinking coffee and reading the coverage with the detached interest of someone reading about a country they have never visited. A local TV reporter stood outside the East Park District station and described the arrest in the careful language of someone aware of potential defamation suits. A columnist for the Baltimore Sun wrote something thoughtful and furious about what it meant that an FBI counterterrorism agent had needed 17 minutes and a field office intervention to protect a right that should have been protected by nothing more than his own innocence. Linda Farris called that afternoon. "How are you doing?" she asked, which from Linda was a clinical question as much as a personal one. "I'm fine." I thought about it. "I'm angry." Good, stay angry, it's useful. A pause. The U.S. Attorney's Office wants to know if you'll testify. Yes. You don't need to decide today. I already decided. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Webb, for what it's worth. Most people in that parking lot don't have a field office to call. I know, I said. That's why I'm testifying. The trial was 8 months later in a federal courtroom on Lombard Street. I had been in courtrooms many times, had testified in closed hearings, classified proceedings, rooms where the gallery was empty and the record was sealed. This one was open. The gallery was full. I sat in the witness box in a gray suit, and I answered every question in the even, precise language of someone who has learned, over 11 years, that facts are the sharpest weapon available. When Holloway's attorney asked whether I had identified myself as a federal agent during the stop, I said no. When he asked why, I looked at him steadily. Because I was collecting evidence of a crime in progress, I said, which is my job. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. The attorney shuffled his papers. Somewhere in the gallery, someone exhaled. Holloway received 4 years in federal prison. Beale received 2 years and was immediately stripped of his pension. The Baltimore Police Department announced a formal review of all arrests made by Holloway's unit over the previous 6 years. 41 cases were identified for re-examination in the first 30 days alone. 3 of those resulted in overturned convictions by the time the maple tree outside my mother's house had gone fully bare for winter. Roberts testified for the prosecution. He lost his position. He found work, eventually, in private security. I don't know what he does with the memory of that parking lot. I think about it sometimes, whether he was a coward who found a line he wouldn't cross, or a decent man who had crossed too many lines already and finally stopped. There's probably not a clean answer to that. There usually isn't. I went back to my mother's house on a Sunday afternoon in March, 6 months after the trial. She made macaroni again, and we sat in the kitchen while the radiator knocked against the wall in its old, irregular rhythm. She didn't ask about the case. She asked about my apartment and whether I was eating enough and when I was going to do something about the alternator on my car, which she had decided was making a concerning noise based on one trip in it 3 years ago. I ate 2 plates and told her I would look at the alternator. She gave me a look that said she would believe it when she saw it. When I left, she stood on the porch in her housecoat, arms crossed, one hand raised halfway. The same mirror image it had always been. I watched her in the rear view, getting smaller, until I turned the corner and the street opened up ahead of me, quiet and familiar and mine. I drove the 3 blocks past King's Corner store without stopping. The parking lot was lit the same as always, orange and flat, a few cars at the edges. An ordinary lot, an ordinary night. I kept driving. The ceramic cat was still on my mother's porch, and the radiator still knocked in the same irregular rhythm it had always knocked, and somewhere in a federal facility, Derek Holloway was working out how to be a person the world had finished believing in. The coffee in my travel cup had gone cold somewhere on the drive. I drank it anyway. It didn't taste like anything I needed to name.